as we continue exploring the principles that determine the shapes and the structures of animals according to the function, one of the concepts that I wanted to emphasize is that every structure of an animal body, even at the level of tissues, then also including organs and organ systems, are going to be under a set of regulations, controls, that will allow the animal to perform at its best whenever it's necessary. This regulation of activity of tissues and organ systems also leads to an optimal use for the energy, which is going to be one of those limitations animals are going to have in any environment where they live. And so one of the concepts of regulation that I want to explain in this video is going to be the idea of feedback control. And for an animal, there are going to be usually two ways that are going to be useful in order to regulate and control the activities the animal is doing. One of those is going to be the nervous system. The nervous system works mostly by means of nerve cells, which have a long extension, which is called the axon. And along the axon of a nerve cell or neuron, there are going to be electric charges that are going to be changing from a polarized to a depolarized state. And the deal about nerve cells and the nervous system is are going to be targeting specific cells or specific tissues, and it's going to be a momentary or only as needed type of a control. The other mechanism animals have for controlling their activities is going to be by means of the endocrine system. The endocrine system is going to be a set of organs. We usually call these glands. The glands of the endocrine system don't have necessarily like a tube, like a vessel through which chemicals known as hormones are going to be released. And so by definition, a hormone is going to be a signaling chemical that is produced and released by glands, and these glands don't have ducts. In other words, the hormones themselves are going to be moving through the spaces in between organs and across cell membranes until they reach the blood, and then they are going to be circulated. The endocrine system is going to be often under the control of master glands, including the hypothalamus and the pituitary. When we look at the idea of regulating activities and regulating what an animal can do, we use two words to distinguish between the two strategies we have in animals. So one is going to be the idea of regulation. A regulator is going to be an animal that uses internal mechanisms, and these internal mechanisms can be sometimes even the activity of organs like muscles. Internal mechanisms could include those glands of the endocrine system to adjust metabolic rates, to increase the use and consumption of energy during times of stress or emergency, or when a certain activity needs to be performed. So regulators can use these internal mechanisms so that they can help maintain a steady internal environment. That is the idea of homeostasis. So homeostasis is achieving internal constancy or a steady internal environment. There are going to be some animals that are going to lack these mechanisms for regulating their activities or internal environmental conditions, and we're going to call these conformers. Conformers in general are going to allow internal conditions to just follow along what the environment is dictating. And in the case of temperatures, which is an easy one to use as an example and to help understand the idea of control and regulators versus conformers, there are animals that if the environment is cold, their body is also going to be cold. And if the environment heats up, well, their body is also going to heat up. Let's consider, for example, the information we have on this slide. So here we see two animals. One is going to be the river otter, and another one's going to be the largemouth bass. The difference between these animals is not where they live, for they may be living in the same river or aquatic environment like a lake that has a stream that is flowing. Otters usually like that water movement as a condition where they want to live. But the water is going to be about the same temperature for both the river otter and also for the bass. What is the difference between them? If you look at this graph, the vertical axis, or y-axis as you may know it, is going to be showing the values for body temperature, as we can go from 0 degrees Celsius, which is going to be close to the freezing point of water, all the way up to 40 and slightly above 40. So this is going to be body temperature, the temperature of the animal. On this horizontal axis or x-axis, what we're going to see is going to be the temperature of the environment. Again, we're going to be going from 0, which is going to be the freezing point of water, to above 40 degrees Celsius. And just for you to have a reference how hot or how warm 40 is, our body temperatures is around 37 degrees Celsius. So 40 is going to be definitely warm. Then if you look at this graph for the body temperature of the otter in relationship to the environmental temperature, you can see that for the otter, the temperature doesn't change. It's going to remain at around 40 degrees Celsius. How can they achieve this when the river or the lake environment is going to be really cold, close to freezing point? The answer is going to be in internal mechanisms and strategies. For example, river otters can increase the release of heat by metabolic activity, contractions of muscles, their own activities, swimming, running, and all of that is going to be linked with the ability for the animal to retain some of that heat, because they have a very nice layer of insulation in the form of fur. So the fur is going to help trap some of that heat to prevent the animal from losing it. If the animal is going to be in a warm environment, likewise, the otter temperature is going to be about 38 degrees Celsius, as you can see over here, very close to ours, but the environment outside may be warmer. Nevertheless, the temperature of the animal is going to be about the same. And that is because this will be, as a regulator, this is going to be an animal that can use strategies for getting rid of excess heat, including maybe increasing the amount of time it can be spending in the water, or maybe through some evaporative cooling strategies, and we will be talking about those in another video that I will be preparing for this chapter. When you look at the largemouth bass, if the water is cold, well, likewise, the body temperature for this animal is going to be cold. If the water is warm up, then also the body temperature for this animal will increase and the animal will be warming up. So the animal is just conforming. Whatever the environment does, that is exactly what the internal conditions of the animal will be doing, always following the environment. So this steady state or homeostasis can be achieved often by means of internal strategies. And these internal strategies can be things like internal organs that can help an animal maintaining a steady state. Let's use the example of temperature, since we started talking about temperature and the previous animals, river otter and the bass. But now we want to maybe apply it to how this works in our case. Whenever you talk about homeostasis, it's important to recognize that there are often going to be a set of conditions we can consider, and when we understand these conditions, then we can see how homeostasis can be achieved. For example, for many of our body functions and for our body conditions we want to keep steady, there's going to be a set point. That set point is going to be like osmolarity of the concentration of solids inside of the cell or the blood. A set point can be also something like levels of oxygen, and if oxygen goes down or if it goes below a level that we can achieve, there's going to be strategies, changes that we can do. So this set point, if something changes it, there is going to be a stimulus with any deviation from a set point. And now let's think about temperature. So for humans, it's going to be around 36, 38. I said in average, it's going to be about 37 degrees Celsius. If there's a deviation in that set point, which we'll call it 37 degrees Celsius, that change is going to be serving as a stimulus. And the stimulus will be sensed by a number of structures in our body, primarily sensory neurons in the brain that can detect that your blood, the blood that is reaching the brain, is going to have a higher temperature. So let's take a look at what happens in the case of this increased body temperature. Our brain is going to be serving as a sensor or a control. So the sensor is going to be an organ or tissues capable of detecting that something has changed. We have broken the steady state. The brain is going to respond by sending electric impulses. Remember, that's going to be one of the ways in which we can regulate things, the nervous system, and I mentioned also the endocrine system. In this case, it's going to be the activity of the brain sending electric potentials over through neurons to sweat glands, so that sweat glands can produce sweat and release sweat. As you know, sweat is largely made of water, and so sweat, being composed of water, will be able to absorb and keep large amounts of heat. When the sweat, which is accumulating on the skin, reaches a certain amount of heat where water molecules are moving so much and hydrogen bonds can break, the water in sweat will evaporate, leaving behind a cooler temperature on the skin. And so that is going to lead to a decrease in temperature, and that decrease in temperature will be, once again, the stimulus that is needed to set the steady state. There's going to be no more production of sweat. This is going to be shut down. Another way in which we can also increase the release of heat, because heat is accumulating, and remember, we're looking at the condition where the body is getting too hot, is going to be increasing the amount of blood circulating through capillaries. And so what you notice with people that have very light skin complexion is that their faces are going to turn red whenever their internal body temperature is increasing by just a fraction of a degree. And that is because the capillaries just underneath the epidermis in the dermal layers are going to be expanding, allowing for more blood to go there, and it's the red of the blood that provides that reddish appearance of the skin. If the temperature decreases back to the normal point, back to the set point, then the signals from the brain for blood capillaries to expand will stop, and then we will achieve once again the steady state. So the response is going to be how the body deals with this change in the set point, how the body deals with the stimulus. And in this case, we're looking at two different ways in which this can happen: by the production of sweat or by the increase of circulation through capillaries near the surface of the skin. You can also look at this example, and you'll probably be able to understand what happens in the event that your body temperature is actually getting lower, how we can go about increasing temperature so that once again we can achieve this steady state. Last time in class, I tell you about feedback control and how in the case of the endocrine system, most of the hormones we produce are going to be under the control of a negative feedback loop. And I told you, for example, how in the wintertime, when animals are not finding very much food and conditions are not favorable for a lot of activities, testosterone levels can be down. The low levels of testosterone will be the signal that goes to the brain, and then the hypothalamus and the pituitary will be producing hormones that will increase inside of the increasing concentration in the blood of the animal until they reach the testes, in the case of a male. That will result in an increase in the production of testosterone. Then comes the springtime, testosterone levels are high. The mission of defending a territory, finding a mate, and reproducing will be accomplished. And when that happens, high levels of testosterone will be what is needed to once again suppress, shut down the production of hormones in the brain, like the hormones produced by the pituitary or the hypothalamus, that will eventually lead to the shutdown in testosterone. So why do we call this a negative feedback loop? What turned off the production of testosterone? It was ultimately too high a level of testosterone. When too much of a product, too much of a concentration of a hormone is built up into a body, that is often going to be the signal to say, okay, too much already, let's shut that down. There are going to be a few cases where hormones can be controlled by a positive feedback. In the case of a positive feedback, what happens is that a product, like a hormone, reaches a high level, and those high levels continue to call for an increased production of that same hormone. And this is going to continue increasing until a mission is accomplished in the life of the animal. Let's take a look. For example, you may be able to read here on this slide what happens in the case of oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to be a hormone that is associated with muscle contractions. And so when the time of labor comes for mammals to give birth, and we can think about humans, when the time comes to deliver a baby, in the case of a woman, the levels of oxytocin will be increasing to the point where contractions in the uterus are going to be so strong that it's going to lead to pains. And so we know that the process of birth is a painful experience for the mother. And what happens is that when the contractions begin, you already have high levels of oxytocin. Then the contractions continue to get more frequent and stronger because levels of oxytocin are continuing to get greater and greater and greater and greater until the contractions are so strong that the newborn can be pushed out of the reproductive tract of the female and a baby is born. Following birth, a woman doesn't stop the production of oxytocin because oxytocin is going to be also responsible for the contraction of smooth muscle that is affiliated with the mammary glands, the glands where milk is going to be produced. And so what continues to provide the stimulus for oxytocin, as you can see, is going to be the suckling, the nursing infant as they feed on milk secreted by the nipple. That is going to provide a stimulus that goes to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus responds by producing more oxytocin. This oxytocin is temporarily stored in the pituitary until eventually it's going to be released and continuing to keep high levels for as long as the infant continues to nurse. And so it is that suckling that is going to be stimulating for more oxytocin, and more oxytocin to continue to be produced. So this is the case of a positive feedback where you have a high level of a product, but instead of shutting down production of that product or hormone, that high level is going to ask for more and more and more until the mission is done. And if you're thinking, well, what is the mission I'm talking about? Remember, I'm talking about the mission of giving birth in the case of mammals, and also the mission of secreting the milk a woman is producing. So I'm talking about milk secretion here, the contraction of smooth muscle that is connected with the milk glands or lactating glands that are responsible for producing the milk in the breast of a female. Not all regulation is going to be in stages where a work is going to be done and then you don't see any of that activity happening. Again, there's also going to be cyclical variation. In cyclical variation, regulation is going to have a period that is going to be regularly repeating. In cyclical variation, we can see how the activities of animals are going to be timed to a time of the day when it's more convenient to do things like feeding, to do things like finding a mate, or even, which is really important, when it's necessary to sleep. And so animals are going to have circadian rhythms. So if we look at this word here, circ is going to be making reference to circular, and dian has to do with day. So every day, there are going to be patterns that are going to be repeating in circles. Think, for example, about your circadian rhythm, and I can tell you also about my circadian rhythm. There's usually going to be a time of the day when we feel sleepy and we go to sleep. There's also going to be a time of the day when we're most active, and one can say maybe even most productive. This graph here is going to be depicting on the horizontal line the hours of the day. Here on one of the vertical axes, we're going to see the temperature of the body, and in another one, we're going to see the melatonin concentration. Let's focus on this side here, on the melatonin concentration. And you will see that melatonin, which is a hormone that is associated with sleep, is going to be at a low concentration during the times of the day when we're active. Take a look, 2 p.m., low levels, 6 p.m., low levels. But by 10 p.m. at nighttime, there begins to occur an increase in the production of melatonin. And this production increases, making us more sleepy. So by 11 p.m., most people on average are going to be preparing for going to bed. By 2 a.m., the concentration continues to increase, and we're going to be sound asleep. Concentration is going to peak at around 4 a.m. From 2 a.m. to 4 a.m., there's going to be this dramatic increase. And then what happens is that the levels of oxytocin, I'm messing this up. The levels of melatonin will begin to go down. And as they continue to drop, we're going to begin to enter a state of greater metabolic activity. And so you will see that the core body temperature will begin to rise, and then we feel awake and we feel like we're ready to begin the day. This is going to be varying because sometimes people are acclimated to a certain schedule. For example, people who work graveyard shifts are not going to have exactly this same kind of a graph. They are going to be alert or awake during the nighttime hours, and they may be more sleepy during the daytime hours, which is when they have a chance to rest. And so patterns of behavior or activity that are going to be repeating every 24 hours, we're going to be calling them circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are going to be those that repeat about every 365 days. And as an example of those circadian rhythms, I mentioned how in animals there are going to be seasons. There's going to be a season when reproduction happens. For many animals, this is going to be in the spring, but for other animals may actually be happening late summer or fall, depending on when resources necessary for reproduction are available. For many animals that live in the southwest desert of the United States, reproduction comes at the end of the summer because that's when the monsoon rains come and there is moisture enough for forming puddles of water, and that is going to be something they need for achieving their metamorphosis of tadpole all the way to adult. I'm talking about something like frogs and toads that live in the desert. So it depends on when the resource that is necessary for carrying on the function of reproduction, when those are available, that is when certain hormones that are necessary for reproduction will be increasing in concentration. So circadian rhythms for yearly patterns and circadian rhythms for day-to-day patterns. And that is all I want to mention in this video. There'll be a couple more to help us understand animal form and function.